Hello everyone, welcome back to another Live at 5 tour with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. I am your host, back from a couple of weeks away. I hope that everyone had a very nice Thanksgiving and that you were safe and also well fed. I know I was. Special thanks to Beth Willoughby for providing me with a little to-go Thanksgiving dinner. Today, I am out here between Kingswood School and the Middle School for Girls, and we are going to be looking at the beautiful bridge right behind me, the Trellis Bridge from 1993. Now, if you take lots of walks around Cranbrook's campus, you have probably come out here and crossed the Trellis Bridge, but you may not know very much about it. It is connecting today the Middle School for Girls parking lot and the Middle School for Girls, but when it was built in 1993, it was part of a way of creating new sort of circulation paths for the ever-expanding Cranbrook campus. And so as the campus was undergoing a series of transformations in the 1980s and 1990s, what we call the Millennium Projects, part of the problem was if we were building new roads to our new buildings and doubling the square footage of Cranbrook's buildings and completely changing how vehicular access came about, well, then we also had to change how pedestrian access worked. And so one of those projects was the Trellis Bridge. And it was designed by the then head of the Cranbrook Academy of Art Architecture Department, Dan Hoffman. And Dan Hoffman came to Cranbrook in 1986. He had studied at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Art and Science in New York under John Haydock, who was an important theoretician of the 20th century. He was dean of the Cooper Union from 76 to 2000. And when Dan Hoffman arrived, he was taking the place of Daniel Libeskind, who was the great radical sort of deconstructivist and also just a sort of radical personality here at the Academy. And so whereas Daniel Libeskind had led the department really into what we might call paper architecture, where Libeskind and his students weren't so much designing buildings or building buildings as they were constructing architectural experiments at the drafting board. It really was this idea that Cranbrook would offer Masters of Fine Arts in architecture. So essentially an art degree in architecture. That was really what Daniel Libeskind had done in the 70s and 80s. Dan Hoffman gets here at the end of the 80s and he takes a very different approach. And his whole idea was, can we reconnect building construction with the architect? And can we reconnect this sort of arts and crafts ideal that the architect, him or herself, knows how to put two bricks together and build a building? And so he saw a problem with architecture in being that architects sat in studios all day and they never actually went out into the field and built anything. And he could not have been better poised when he took over the department in 86 to actually have the chance to experiment and build things here on the campus. Because at the time, Cranbrook was realizing its long-awaited goal of the Woodward Access Road. And so if you scroll back in time, I think in July, I did a tour of the Woodward Access Arrival feature, which you can just see the wings sort of up above the hill. And so when this road was built, it was planned by Johnson & Johnson and Roy, who were landscape architects out in Ann Arbor, JJR, now part of the Smith Group. And JJR planned this as a botanic boulevard. And so before, if you had visited Cranbrook, you would have approached all of the Cranbrook institutions from the residential city streets. And with this new Woodward Access Road, you would be able to connect between all of the institutions on internal streets. And this idea of a botanical parkway that or Johnson Johnson and Roy and George Baird proposed is that it would be like Frederick Law Olmsted and his great sort of boulevards outside of Atlanta, or some of the parks in New York, where you would sort of take your motorized carriage through, and you would be surrounded by hundreds of different plant species and tree species, and it would really be a parked way. But one problem was this little crossing of the river here. And what happened was, okay, you can plan a botanical parkway all you want, but if you have the realities of modern day city planning and sort of the city of Bloomfield Hills saying the road has to be a certain width, it was thought that this concrete bridge for cars was getting way too big, and that for pedestrians to safely cross alongside this same bridge, you would end up needing to make it 8 feet wider. And at that point, it was thought the scale is just way too big. This whole concrete bridge is going to be way bigger than anything at Cranbrook, and we should go back to the drawing board and rethink, how can we make this bridge for cars smaller? And the solution was to simply take the pedestrians and the bike path off of this bridge. And so then the idea was, we'll build a separate bridge for pedestrian crossings. And it was at that point that Dan Hoffman comes into the scene and says, I'm the head of architecture. I have all these architecture students, and I'm telling them the best way to be an architect is to be out there with tools and with materials building a building. Why don't you let the architecture students of the Art Academy build this new pedestrian crossing? Now, Dr. Lillian Bowder, who was head of Cranbrook at the time, looks at his proposal, and a lot of her board members and a lot of people at Cranbrook said, that is going to be way too expensive. You should just let the contractors who are going to build this steel reinforced, very functional, though lovely detailed bridge, build a pedestrian bridge. It's going to be way cheaper. This wooden thing is going to go entirely over budget. But Dr. Bowder, to her credit, trusted her head of architecture, and she admired his enthusiasm and his sort of pluck that he wanted to build this bridge. And so between 1991 and 1993, Dan Hoffman and some of the architecture students worked on the design of the Trellis Bridge. Now, it is made of laminated wooden beams and then bolts as well. And so it's sort of bolted laminated wood. And one thing, when you look at it, you might think that this trellis is actually doing some of the structural labor. It's not. So it's entirely decorative. It's entirely meant to serve as this sort of planted arbor. It's supposed to be covered in vines, in clematis vines, though I don't think that we keep the vines growing on it. So essentially what you're looking at is two structural systems. There's the bridge itself, which is standing up and supporting us walking across it just by these two parallel beams, and then the diagonal support beams going across. So that's actually doing the labor of supporting the bridge. And it is augmented, or the support continues with these cross braces here. Let's see, if I should not have worn my dress shoes with flat bottoms, but we're going to make it under the bridge. And so you can see here how the wooden beams are then supporting those main, the main railings are essentially the structural support. And so these structural railings are then supported below by these cross beams, which are then connected by steel tie rods. So I had to take structures classes in architecture school. So we did a lot of this type of diagramming where you lay out the beams and the columns and all the sort of structural elements and trace the load. But essentially what these steel ties are doing is keeping the pressure from pushing the bridge apart and causing a structural collapse. Now, all of these glue lam beams is what you would call them, These are constructed of wooden pieces that are glued together to enhance the strength. So if we look at this, this is not just one piece of wood, but is instead pieces that one actually is just one piece of wood. Where's my glue lamb? Then there are other sections that are glued together to enhance the strength. And so it ends up being a much stronger bridge because it is not only straight wooden beams, but glued together wooden beams as well. So then the second structural system, we'll see if we can just wander under the entire bridge. I thought that the lights might come on while we are doing this tour, but I was over here last night testing out the Wi-Fi on a walk and the lights never came on, so we'll have to finish a little bit before the sun sets. The second structural system is the actual trellis, which gives us the name of the Trellis Bridge. And so those are these glue lamb pieces that are bent up and are only supporting themselves. And so why did Dan Hoffman do that? Well, Hoffman described it as a combination of the best of Eliel Saarinen's principles. And he saw those as the romance of nature with the order of industry. And so he combines this idea of a garden trellis and of making this a real feature in a garden. Remember, he wanted it to be entirely covered by vines so you have the sort of romance of the garden, of the nature, combined with the orderliness or the functionality of industry. And so you have these steel bars and then all of the bolts that are tightened to actually create the structural system. And it is this sort of leather and lace combination of wood, nature, and steel. We made it successfully under the bridge and back up above board. Now, the actual labor of constructing the Trellis Bridge, there was some, concern about essentially having Cranbrook Academy of Art students who are paying a tuition to study here, then being labor for Cranbrook. And so students either graduated before they worked for the Cranbrook Architectural Office, or they would take a semester off and be paid to work for the Cranbrook Architectural Office. That name, the CAO, was something that Eliel Saarinen had headed in the 1930s and was in existence under Henry Booth's direction in the 1950s. It then sort of was discontinued, but Dan Hoffman brought it back, this idea that Cranbrook would maintain a licensed professional architectural practice. So the bridge was designed by Dan Hoffman and executed by the CAO, the Cranbrook Architectural Office. And the leading student who graduated in 1993, who really brought the bridge into fruition, was Ted Galante. And Theodore Galante was from Long Island. His father was ran a steel fabrication shop, and his mother was also a big crafter and big into sort of fabrication. And so he grew up being surrounded by makers who were always sort of producing things and exploring his father's steel shop. They grew up in a house on Long Island that his father built for the family, and yet he went off to college and then went to Wall Street. And he was very unhappy as a sort of wolf on Wall Street. And so he came to Cranbrook to sort of change the course of his career. He had all of these skills from growing up as a craftsman, and he really took the lead on the execution of this project. Now, it was built off-site, and so they bent all of these wood beams. So to get the curve of the trellis, they would take the wood and then they would glue it together into the curve and then bolt it on site. And the entire thing was trucked in. So it's just 58 feet long by, I don't know the actual dimension. What do we say? 9 feet wide. But it's the dimension of a flatbed truck. And so the entire thing came driving into the site, almost like a dinosaur on the back of a flatbed, from the warehouse where they had constructed it. And then they had an enormous crane set up in the area on that side of the riverbank. And they lifted it up, and Dr. Bowder talks about just having this moment of panic as she sees this skeleton up in the sky thinking, what have I done commissioning these students essentially to build this bridge? And then her sense of relief when the crane lowered the bridge into place and it fit perfectly on the concrete pilings which had been poured alongside the vehicular bridge. And then she said she suddenly had the confidence in her architect, Dan Hoffman. Now, Ted Galante would stay on with the Cranbrook Architectural Office, and he is who supervised the construction of the Brookside ECC entrance feature and a lot of the handmade furniture at Brookside for Peter Rose. Peter Rose, the Cambridge-based Canadian architect who built the Early Childhood Center, was so impressed by this young architect student that he ended up hiring him to come out to Cambridge. Ted Galante went out to Cambridge, where he learned that he worked better with Peter Rose if they had a few hundred miles between them. So they only worked together for a few months before he set up his own practice. And so Ted Galante is still an architect working in Cambridge. He's done a lot of fire stations, libraries, private residences. He runs a sort of boutique handmade architecture firm there in Cambridge. Dan Hoffman left the architecture department in 1996 to become full-time architect for the architectural office, which he left that position when the Cranbrook Architectural Office closed for the second time in 1999. And at that point, Hoffman became a University of Michigan professor and now is out at the University of Arizona, and he's part of an office there called Team Ma, I think. And Hoffman, of course, designed the entrance feature. He designed the Woodward Access Road, he designed our light fixtures, and all of this was part of that Botanic Parkway connecting from Woodward Avenue's entrance up through the middle of campus to the arrival feature by Wani Palasma with Dan Hoffman, and then all the little light fixtures that accompany it. Sadly, these light fixtures are not Dan Hoffman's because when they built the girls' middle school, they put in new light fixtures along this path. Hoffman had this idea of lighting, and I was waiting for these to come on. These are also Dan Hoffman and Cranbrook Architectural Office and student projects. So these are copper light reflectors that are inspired by Eliel Saarinen's designs for the vents on the top of Kingswood School. And so they're the same material, the copper color, and they're even taken the design quite obviously in debt to Saarinen's designs for the chimneys on Kingswood. And then as the sun sets, I was really hoping that the little Christmas lights on the Trellis Bridge would click on, but I'm not sure they're going to do it. But you do see the sort of beauty of this path, and then the Rouge River running underneath it towards Kingswood Lake and out the other side. I don't know if anyone has any questions while I walk, just to give you a better sense of where we are. You see here the lovingly referred to as the Country Club entrance of Cranbrook with the contract land maintenance program that looks great year-round. And then Kingswood School is just over this angly wood through there. So I don't know if anyone has any other questions about the Trellis Bridge. Thank you to the follower who requested I come out here and discuss it. It feels like we've been together so long now. I am back in snowy weather. So we started with one of our first tours was in a snowstorm at Kingswood, and we're back to having snow on the ground. I have a few exciting Live at Fives coming up for you the rest of December, so stay tuned for Wednesdays at 5 o'clock. And then next Sunday, December 13th, I'm doing a holiday tour of Cranbrook House with my friends over at the Cranbrook House and Gardens Auxiliary. It's going to be a virtual event, and you can get tickets to that over at center.cranbrook.edu. So if you want to learn more about the Booth family and their traditions here at Cranbrook House, make sure you sign up for that. I love the way with the Trellis Bridge that this sort of top beam runs across, and it seems so lightly connected because the wood is doing the sort of labor of holding that beam up there. But in order to actually connect the glue lamb to this center beam, they just use these little bins of steel. And so I think it shows the sort of relative strength by scale of these larger wooden beams, which are the sort of same, carrying the same load as these very small little steel bins. Now, hello. That is okay. There goes the Earls. That is the head of our 2D design department and his family, who have run across his former colleague's bridge. I don't think that the vines are, I don't think they maintain the vines at all. And I don't exactly blame them. I don't know what kind of interaction vines and wood have. You know, vines and brick, terrible combination. But I have never seen it covered in vines. It is much more sort of surrounded by nature than it was when it was first dropped in place. It looks quite shocking, this sort of bright yellow pine within this sort of completely ripped out muddy landscape and all these little plants potted. So it certainly has achieved the sort of botanic garden look with all of the Michigan native species, over 100 different types of plants and trees planted around the Trellis Bridge. And I thought I would just bring you up to end our Live at 5 tour with a little view of Kingswood. Of course, the students are no longer meeting in person, but the school is still here and looking resplendent in this early winter sunset. And so I think you see again Hoffman's idea of the Saarinen's romantic naturalism and orderly industry combined here at Kingswood, and we see those vent hoods that were the reference point for the vehicular bridge lighting. This scarf is the Morse College scarf from J Press, representing my Eero Saarinen College. So it's good to be back, everyone. Thanks for your patience while I had a little bit of time off and then the Thanksgiving holiday. I'll be back next Wednesday for another Live at 5. I hope that you enjoyed this evening's presentation on the Trellis Bridge, and I'll just leave you with this view of the Saarinen family's magnum opus, Kingswood School for Girls, completed in 1931. And what an evening. Thanks for watching, everyone. And if you're in the area, make sure that you swing by campus and check out the winter landscape. Oh, what an evening. So today, of course, the high school is co-educational, but originally this was the girls' school, and so we connect the Trellis Bridge. It connects over to the middle school for girls from 2013, and then it connects to the historic school for girls here. And now we're just enjoying gratuitous live architectural footage. Keep your eyes peeled on your email inbox if you have signed up for the Center Cranbrook email. My History of Architecture course for the winter of 2021 will be launching here within the next hour. So that is going to be, I'm sure, the highlight of my January and February, and I hope that you'll consider signing up if you've enjoyed these free Facebook Live at 5 tours. These are going to be extended 75-minute long lectures about the history of American architecture through the lens of Cranbrook and the architects who have visited Cranbrook over the years. thanks so much for joining, and I will see you next Wednesday at 5 o'clock for another Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Live at 5.